Inside a high-stakes federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett goes head-to-head with Judge Andrew H. Stone in a bombshell case against Harrington Dynamics, accused of secretly poisoning entire communities with toxic waste. Stone sneers at her arguments, shuts down her objections, and commands the room with the smugness of a man who thinks he's untouchable. Until just minutes later, Crockett detonates the courtroom with a chain of evidence so explosive, it doesn't just silence the room, it rips through the nation's illusion of justice. When the man behind the gavel becomes the one on trial, what's left of the system we're told to trust? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air inside courtroom 7A didn't just hum, it vibrated with anticipation, like the seconds before a lightning strike. Cameras were forbidden, but that didn't stop the swarm of reporters scribbling furiously, their pens clicking like weapons being cocked. The gallery was standing room only. Legal scholars, activists, retired judges, Wall Street executives, all waiting to see how far this would go. At the heart of it all was a case that had fractured public trust. United States versus Harrington Dynamics, a $14 billion conglomerate accused of laundering campaign donations, burying toxic waste beneath minority neighborhoods, and bribing local officials into silence. It wasn't just a corporate scandal, it was an indictment of a system many believed had long sold out to the highest bidder. And presiding over it was Judge Andrew H. Stone, the iron-jawed, black-robed titan of federal law, infamous for his ruthless cross-examinations and his disdain for what he called emotional theatrics. He entered the chamber like a Roman general to a Colosseum, robe flowing, chin lifted, his presence alone shrinking the oxygen in the room. He had built a reputation not just as a judge, but as a political gatekeeper, tough on grandstanding, merciless toward lawyers who didn't know their place, which made his matchup today with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett more than a legal battle. It was a powder keg. Crockett didn't flinch. She rose from the prosecution's table with the steady calm of someone long used to being underestimated and paying the price for it. Her navy suit caught the courtroom lights, but it was her eyes, sharp, focused, unshakable, that held the room. She hadn't left the halls of Congress for publicity. She came for accountability. Harrington's elite legal team, gray-haired, overpaid and smug, muttered as she stood. Some sneered. Others laughed under their breath. She didn't care. She was here for the poisoned families, the silenced whistleblowers. The truth buried under non-disclosure agreements and campaign checks. Judge Stone had a history. He ruled for corporations nearly 3 out of 4 times. But Crockett wasn't here to play the odds. She was here to crack them wide open. She had barely uttered the phrase "new financial evidence" when the shift came, subtle at first, like the tightening of a bowstring before the arrow flies. Judge Andrew Stone leaned back in his towering leather chair, the overhead lights casting hard shadows across his face, giving his smirk the look of something carved from granite. With deliberate slowness, he slid his reading glasses down his nose, not to see better, but to see her worse. "Tell me, Congresswoman," he began, voice smooth as oil but lined with blades, "are we still in federal court, or did I stumble onto a casting call for law and order?" The courtroom didn't erupt. It winced. A few uneasy chuckles surfaced, mostly from the defense table, but even those were thin and hollow, like glass tapping against a tombstone. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the evidence binder, still unopened. Her gaze didn't waver, didn't blink. But beneath the surface, under the composed breath, behind the unshaken shoulders, was the familiar sensation of institutional condescension, tightening around her throat like an invisible collar. She had been here before. Not this courtroom, not this judge, but this exact moment. The moment where truth meets the wall of power and power laughs. The moment when a woman of color, armed with facts and fire, is told implicitly or explicitly that her presence is an inconvenience to the traditions of power. Judge Stone wasn't questioning her evidence. He was questioning her right to introduce it, to possess it, to even stand there. Still seated, Stone let out a theatrical sigh and tapped the bench twice. "So let me get this straight," he said, voice rising just enough to ensure the entire gallery heard every syllable. After 2 years of investigation, a sealed indictment, a full trial calendar, and extensive pretrial motions, you've suddenly, miraculously, stumbled upon offshore accounts. He arched an eyebrow as if speaking to a misbehaving student, not a sitting member of Congress and federal prosecutor. What's next? A smoking gun mailed to your hotel room? A confession written on the back of a cocktail napkin? More laughter from the defense team, the kind of cruel amusement that didn't come from humor, but dominance. Crockett inhaled slowly through her nose, not as a pause, but as a quiet refusal to let rage take the wheel. Her mind calculated the damage, the optics, the trap being set before her. This wasn't about one piece of evidence. It was about control. It was about erasing her authority with a shrug and a joke. And worse, it was working. The judge had the room. The stenographer hesitated at her keys. Jurors looked confused. Even reporters, those wolves of spectacle, leaned back in their chairs, unsure whether to take this seriously. And yet, Crockett stayed still, calm, precise. "Your Honor," she began, voice low but cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "This isn't television, and I'm not here for applause." She reached forward, opened the binder, and lifted the first page. Wire transfer logs linking Harrington Dynamics to a shell corporation in Belize, dated just 3 weeks prior. This is admissible under Rule 26 as supplemental discovery obtained under a judicially approved warrant. Its relevance is immediate, and its origin is lawful. No tremble in her tone, no plea in her words. Just the cold edge of a woman who had prepared not just for this trial, but for this very humiliation. But the injustice hung in the air like poison gas. Judge Stone had not just attacked the motion, he had attacked her. Publicly, deliberately, in front of a courtroom that watched it happen in real time and said nothing. And Jasmine Crockett, alone behind her desk of papers and truth, stood as the only one willing to say, "This will not be ignored." The gavel had not yet struck, but the fight had already begun. The moment Jasmine Crockett began citing the first offshore transaction, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop. "This transfer," she stated, lifting a page from the binder, "was executed 3 days before a regulatory exemption was granted to Harrington Dynamics. One signed off without public notice." Her voice was measured, legal language precise. It was routed through a Cayman-based entity later identified by Treasury analysts as a Harrington-controlled asset. The courtroom was silent, attentive. But before she could proceed to the second transaction, Judge Stone raised a hand, sharp, impatient. "That's enough," he snapped, without even glancing at the document. "We're not going to derail these proceedings with speculative treasure maps and offshore fairy tales." His tone wasn't one of neutral arbitration. It was accusatory, almost disdainful. Crockett attempted to clarify. "Your Honor, these records were obtained through valid warrants and fall within the court's evidentiary scope under—" But Stone cut in again. "Spare me the citations, Miss Crockett. This court isn't here to entertain a last-minute rescue mission for a weak case." He didn't overrule with reason. He dismissed with contempt. Then, with a calculated pause, Stone leaned forward and added, "Tell me, is this how your office handled the Westover case?" The name hit the room like a dropped gavel. Crockett remained composed, but she understood exactly what he was doing. Westover had been a publicly embarrassing prosecution 2 years prior, poorly managed, poorly vetted, and ultimately dismissed. It had nothing to do with her. "Because from where I sit," Stone continued, "this feels like the same pattern all over again. Rushed evidence, shifting targets, procedural desperation." His words were deliberate, his voice low but cutting. It wasn't a legal argument. It was a public indictment of her professionalism. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice or bristle with emotion. "For the record, Your Honor," she said, steady and unshaken, "the Westover prosecution was led by a separate office under separate supervision. I had no role in that matter. The evidence before this court today was obtained through judicially authorized subpoenas and has been properly disclosed under Rule 26. She didn't defend herself. She defended the law. Her restraint was not passivity. It was tactical precision in the face of an attack meant to delegitimize her authority. And though the judge's words had drawn blood, She made sure the courtroom heard something louder. She would not be broken by them. And yet, through every interruption, every public slight, every false connection drawn to cases she had never touched, Jasmine Crockett stood unmoved. But stillness did not mean surrender. It meant control. Her silence was not compliance. It was the loading of a weapon, one carefully built not from emotion, but from fact. She had asked for a sidebar, a simple procedural request to address what was fast becoming judicial misconduct. It was denied without a moment's thought, waved off with a smirk, as if transparency meant humiliation for her alone. Stone didn't want a private conversation. He wanted a spectacle, a courtroom where his authority reigned unchecked and unquestioned. And in doing so, he left her only one option: to strike back not with fury, but with precision. What happened next wasn't improvisation. It was the unveiling of a contingency she had prepared for long before she ever stepped foot into courtroom 7A. Crockett adjusted her posture, not defensive, but deliberate. Her voice didn't rise, but it hardened into steel. "Your Honor," she began, each word paced with the rhythm of a final warning. "Due to the escalating pattern of judicial hostility, your repeated rejection of admissible evidence without proper review, and your personal references to unrelated cases, the prosecution formally moves for your recusal from these proceedings on the grounds of demonstrated bias and undisclosed conflicts of interest." The sentence didn't need theatrical flair. Its weight did the talking. The gallery fell into absolute stillness. No coughs, no scribbling pens, not even the rustle of suits shifting in leather chairs. On the defense side, an attorney's expression collapsed into blank disbelief. Stone blinked once but said nothing. His hand, which had spent the last hour gesturing with impunity, now curled slightly against the edge of the bench. And then, without a single wasted motion, Crockett nodded to her lead aide. A sealed blue binder was passed into the hands of the courtroom bailiff, thick enough to make the wood beneath it creak. The courtroom watched it travel toward the bench like a slow-moving verdict. The label read simply, "Motion to recuse, Exhibits A through H." The moment the file touched the judge's desk, something shifted, not in volume, but in gravity. The performance had ended. What followed would not be spectacle. It would be record. For the first time that morning, the courtroom belonged not to the robe, but to the facts. And the person delivering them had just claimed the floor, not by force, but by truth. The moment Judge Stone cracked open the blue binder, a visible tension spread across his jawline. A flicker of recognition, of dread, or both. He scanned the first document without lifting his head, but everyone in the courtroom saw the shift in his expression. His fingers, so confident on the bench minutes earlier, now hesitated over the pages. Inside were detailed records of 17 financial transactions, each traceable, time-stamped, and linked to Meridian Strategies LLC, a company legally owned by his brother-in-law, but functionally operated as a financial proxy. The recipients of those payments? A web of subsidiaries under Harrington Dynamics, the very defendant in this federal trial. Jasmine Crockett had not submitted vague claims or unverified leads. These were official wire logs reviewed by forensic accountants, and each transaction coincided, down to the week, with Stone's rulings in past Harrington-related cases. Rulings that had suppressed subpoenas, sealed testimonies, and once even dismissed an EPA complaint without full hearing. The implication wasn't circumstantial. It was systematic. But it wasn't just the money. It was the motive. Attached behind the transaction summary were 3 sworn affidavits, each from former clerks who had served under Stone. Each account was deeply personal, uncomfortably specific. One clerk, whose initials were redacted, but whose affidavit was notarized and authenticated, recalled Stone muttering after a 2020 regulatory hearing, "Crockett again? I've had enough of her righteous nonsense since that coastal petroleum mess. She wants to turn every case into a racial crusade." Another affidavit cited a moment during Chambers' review where Stone allegedly said, "She's not here for justice. She's here for attention. I don't trust anything with her name on it." The third was the most damning, recounting a conversation where Stone referred to Crockett as a political liability in a suit and vowed she'd never win a case in his courtroom. These weren't anonymous tips. They were declarations signed under penalty of perjury, accompanied by internal calendar logs and location records that aligned with each incident. Crockett waited for no reaction. Her voice came in low, unwavering. These exhibits, along with a full memorandum, were submitted at 8:47 a.m. this morning to the Judicial Ethics Review Committee and concurrently to the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Division, she said. They are now part of active review. She didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of the words did all the lifting. In a courtroom built to amplify power, she had just inverted the balance. Without shouting, without pleading, and without ever stepping outside the law. And now, with the binder lying open on his bench, its contents laid bare for all to see, Judge Andrew H. Stone was no longer the one doing the judging. The weight of the binder still hung over the courtroom like a thundercloud, thick with implications, when a sudden shift in energy pulled every gaze toward the side entrance. The door opened, not dramatically, but with a quiet urgency that cut deeper than any shout. A court clerk entered, her pace quick, face pale, both hands clutched tightly around a large sealed envelope bearing the gold insignia of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. No one dared speak. Even Judge Stone seemed momentarily caught off guard. She crossed the floor with precision, each footstep echoing against the marble as if marking the seconds before impact. When she reached the bench, her words were measured but heavy. Emergency directive from the appellate court, delivered by secure dispatch. Time sensitive. She handed it directly to the judge, her fingertips releasing the envelope only when his reluctantly accepted it. Stone's hands, once unwavering in their command of the courtroom, now betrayed him. The tremor in his grip was unmistakable. His thumb hesitated at the wax seal, as though some part of him already knew what lay inside. And then, he opened it. The first sentence struck like a blade. All proceedings under docket number 2, 914-F, are hereby ordered paused, effective immediately, pending review of judicial recusal request and potential conflicts of interest. The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence itself became the reaction, a silence so dense it seemed to press against the walls. A bailiff lowered his eyes. A juror's pen slipped from her hand. The courtroom reporter, who had typed through hours of crossfire, now sat motionless, fingers hovering above her machine, like they'd lost their purpose. Judge Stone didn't speak. He just stared at the page, jaw clenched, the paper slowly crumpling where his grip had tightened unconsciously. The authority that had animated every word he uttered that morning now drained from his frame. His face, once flushed with dominance, turned a cold, uneven gray. Behind the bench, the great seal of the court loomed above him like a reminder, not of power, but of accountability. And across the room, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her stillness wasn't shock. It was readiness. The room had waited for his reaction, but now it was reacting to hers. Without raising her voice, without rising from her seat, she had forced the entire machinery of federal authority to confront itself. The trial had been paused, but something far greater had just begun. The air inside courtroom 7A had become almost unbreathable, thick with suspicion, frozen in disbelief. The appellate court's emergency stay still sat in Judge Stone's hands, its language cold and unforgiving, yet he hadn't spoken since opening it. His lips remained parted. His eyes, once sharp with control, now stared blankly at the middle distance. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished, not by a mile. If what had come before was structure, now came the collapse. She reached deliberately into her binder and pulled out 2 folders, both thicker than the last, both marked with crisp white labels. Exhibit G and Exhibit H. The prosecution table, until now a fortress of quiet endurance, became the center of gravity in the room. Your Honor, she began, voice unwavering, these final submissions pertain directly to rulings previously issued by this court. Rulings that, based on newly uncovered evidence, appear compromised by financial entanglement. Her hand rested on Exhibit G as she spoke. Within this file are bank records, 5 distinct wire transfers sent from Harrington Dynamics to Caribbean Holdings LLC, an offshore entity domiciled in the British Virgin Islands. The transfers were routed through layered intermediaries, but forensic tracing links them all back to Meridian Strategies, the same shell firm associated with your brother-in-law. A collective shift rustled through the gallery, subtle, instinctive. Even the defense table, usually smug with confidence, had fallen unnervingly quiet. These 5 transfers, she continued, lifting the top document without removing it from the folder, were executed just days within 72 hours before 5 key rulings issued by this court in favor of Harrington Dynamics over the past 31 months. In each instance, those rulings shielded the defendant from regulatory scrutiny, suppressed critical subpoenas, or dismissed whistleblower testimony outright. She looked directly at Stone now. Her voice remained controlled, but each word struck like a bell tolling over marble. Your rulings, Your Honor, coincided with payments. She didn't say bribe. She didn't need to. The numbers said it for her. Then came the second folder, Exhibit H. She placed it carefully on top of the first, but didn't open it. Not yet. This exhibit, she announced, includes a certified audio recording and its corresponding transcript. Her tone darkened, not louder, but deeper. It was captured at a private dinner at the Cypress Club less than 4 weeks ago. Present at that dinner, Mr. Charles Harrington, CEO of the defendant corporation, and Your Honor, yourself. No one moved. Jasmine continued. In the course of that conversation, recorded legally by a third-party witness seated nearby, you made the following statement: Crockett will never make it to a jury. There was no outburst, no gasp, just stillness, hard, irreversible, because now it was personal, not procedural, not circumstantial. A federal judge had been caught on tape undermining a prosecutor by name, suggesting the outcome of a case hadn't merely been predicted. It had already been decided. Judge Stone's face turned a shade paler, and his mouth pressed into a hard line. The paper from the appellate court, still in his hand, began to curl slightly from the pressure of his grip. The illusion of control, once total, was now visibly unraveling. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, movement. At the back of the courtroom, 3 men stood up in unison. No flash, no badge held aloft. But they didn't need introductions. Their posture was unmistakable. Broad stance, clean suits, no papers in their hands, no laptops or notepads in front of them. One wore a dark tie with a muted federal insignia. Another had a credentials lanyard half tucked into his jacket. All eyes turned toward them instinctively, like iron pulled toward a magnet. They weren't observers. They were federal agents, FBI, Public Corruption Division. They did not speak. They did not approach. They simply stood, watching, still, alert, not to intervene, not yet, but to bear witness to what came next. And though the judge sat in the tallest chair, and though the defense team was lined with Ivy League pedigree, and though the courtroom still carried his name on the docket, everyone in that room understood. The balance of power had shifted, and Jasmine Crockett was the one who moved it. And as the tension rippled outward from the standing FBI agents like a fault line preparing to rupture, Jasmine Crockett remained a pillar of poised certainty. She reached into her case folder, unshaken, deliberate, and retrieved a sealed federal envelope. Without flair or flourish, she extended it to the lead agent. Her words were steady, razor clear. This is a federal arrest warrant for Judge Andrew H. Stone, signed at 7:52 a.m. this morning by Judge Elena M. Hernandez of the Southern District. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable carried the weight of constitutional authority, and the courtroom knew it. The agent gave a small nod, tucked the envelope into his coat, and turned toward the judge's private chambers. The room seemed to shrink as he walked. He reached the door, knocked twice, firmly, officially. Judge Stone, federal agents, we need you to come out immediately. We have a judicial warrant issued for your detainment. The silence behind the door was sharp, artificial, like a man thinking through 1,000 outcomes and not liking any of them. Another knock, louder now. Judge, this is not a request. Open the door. Nothing. No footsteps, no voice. Just that awful stillness, thick and deliberate. The agent exchanged a glance with his partner. One reached into his inner pocket, produced a bypass tool, and slid it into the lock. The mechanism gave way with a muted click. Then they disappeared inside. Every person in the courtroom sat frozen, not by force, but by awe. It was the kind of stillness usually reserved for final verdicts, funerals, or historical broadcasts. Seconds passed. Then the door opened again. And what emerged was not the same man who had entered it just an hour earlier. Judge Stone appeared, flanked on either side by federal officers. His shoulders were drawn in tight, his face rigid, eyes fixed downward. His blazer, once immaculate, now clung unevenly to his frame, as if it no longer recognized its wearer. Where once he had held the room with theatrical scorn, now he moved with the awkwardness of a man caught between two collapsing worlds, his authority and the truth. A soft commotion erupted as phones came up. Journalists scrambled into position, and the back row pressed forward. The courtroom became a storm of blinking lights and whispered disbelief. Even the defense attorneys, whose silence had grown more desperate by the hour, looked shell-shocked. Judge Stone said nothing. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at the bench. He didn't look at her. But Jasmine Crockett looked at him. She rose only halfway, her hands resting lightly on the prosecution table. And in the quietest moment of that chaotic room, she said just one thing. Not for the press, not for the cameras, not for revenge, for the record. No one stands above justice. And suddenly the silence returned, heavier than before. What began as a tense courtroom standoff quickly mutated into a national reckoning. Because the moment Judge Andrew Stone was escorted from his own courtroom, the walls of secrecy that had long insulated power didn't just crack, they collapsed. By the time Stone had been led past the final row of stunned observers, the first 30-second clip had already hit the internet. Captured by a court reporter's phone, the grainy footage showed the once untouchable judge being calmly escorted by federal agents. His expression hollow, his silence deafening. Within an hour, the clip had amassed over 4 million views. By nightfall, every major cable news outlet ran it on loop, bookended by the same ominous chyron. Sitting federal judge detained mid-trial. But it wasn't just the visual. The symbolism was too potent, too raw. For decades, Judge Stone had loomed over courtrooms like a fixed monument of power, his rulings seen as final, his voice unchallengeable. And now, in the span of minutes, he had become the story, a man dragged from behind the bench, unmasked by the very process he once controlled. Across social media, hashtags surged. #, fall of the gavel. #, judge the judge. #, justice reclaimed. This wasn't just viral, it was volcanic. On Capitol Hill, the tremors were immediate. Senators and representatives who had once praised Stone as a model of judicial consistency suddenly found themselves scrambling for distance. By the next morning, 4 sitting U.S. senators released joint statements claiming they were deeply disturbed by the allegations. 3 of them had attended Stone's confirmation hearings. One had accepted over $75,000 in bundled campaign donations connected to Harrington Dynamics, the very company at the heart of the scandal. Within 24 hours, all 4 offices had issued formal notices of returning contributions and reevaluating judicial vetting procedures. A longtime ally of Stone's on the Senate Judiciary Committee was quoted, off record, saying, "We were warned, but we never thought he'd be arrogant enough to leave fingerprints." What had started in one courtroom now echoed through every power corridor in Washington. The press didn't hold back. The Washington Post labeled it a constitutional tremor. CNN ran a live panel where former federal prosecutors called it an event without precedent in modern jurisprudence. The New York Times editorial board simply called it what it was, a reckoning long overdue. But perhaps the most chilling headline came from a late-night segment on national television, where a legal analyst said, "For years we've told ourselves the robes meant neutrality. Today proved otherwise." Broadcast after broadcast played the clip. Stone's hunched figure, the agents at his sides, and the flashbulbs igniting like gunfire as he stepped into the hallway. Even without sound, the image told the full story. When justice finally turns around, it doesn't knock. It kicks the door open. Inside the federal judiciary, the ripple was no less seismic. That same afternoon, the chief judge of the district officially announced that Judge Andrew Stone had been placed on emergency suspension pending full investigation. More importantly, he issued a reassignment order for every active case on Stone's docket, 47 in total, including 5 high-profile federal trials and multiple class actions. And the case that had started it all, United States versus Harrington Dynamics, that would now be overseen by Judge Lenora Carlisle, a respected, fiercely independent jurist with no ties to the defense or prosecution. Her reputation for surgical legal reasoning and intolerance for procedural theatrics immediately shifted the conversation. The message was unmistakable. This trial was not going to disappear. Not under her watch, not now. But the public wasn't done reckoning. At rallies in Boston, Chicago, and Sacramento, protest signs began appearing with Stone's face crossed out in red. Some read, "How many judges are hiding behind the bench?" Others asked, "How long did they all know?" It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the system that protected him. Whispers of internal memos, ignored complaints, and warning signs buried in ethics committees started surfacing in independent watchdog publications. Legal podcasts went into overdrive. Law professors rewrote lecture syllabi in real time. First-year students at Yale, Georgetown, and UCLA all received the same urgent email. Please note, the scheduled module on judicial accountability has been updated. And still, at the center of the whirlwind, Jasmine Crockett said almost nothing. When approached by press outside the courthouse that night, she gave no victory speech, no clever soundbite. She simply said, "We followed the law." The law answered. It wasn't performative. It was the point. She didn't need to celebrate. Because while the cameras had captured the moment Stone was walked out, what mattered far more was everything that came before it. Every denied motion, every condescending remark. Every time someone like her was told the system worked best when unquestioned. She hadn't exposed a man. She had exposed a pattern. The Department of Justice issued a brief statement confirming Stone's detainment and the opening of a multi-agency inquiry. The Judicial Ethics Commission, which had been publicly quiet for months, launched a formal disciplinary review with subpoena authority. Subcommittees in the House and Senate began requesting files. By day 3, the Supreme Court itself issued an internal memo reinforcing the mandatory reporting obligations of all judges regarding financial disclosures and conflicts of interest. What had once been procedural boilerplate was now treated like gospel. Meanwhile, back in courtroom 7A, the plaque bearing Judge Stone's name had been removed. In its place, a temporary nameplate read simply, "Pending reassignment." The wood-paneled chamber, once charged with fear and hierarchy, had been reduced to what it truly was. A room. Just a room. Empty chairs. Blank pages. A bench that no longer commanded reverence but awaited redemption. The story was no longer just viral. It was historical. And it had only just begun. But while the nation reeled, dissecting every frame of the footage and every sentence of the ruling, Jasmine Crockett did what she had always done. She stepped out of the spotlight and walked straight back into the work. The press swarm outside the courthouse was blinding. Dozens of microphones held aloft like weapons, cameras lined shoulder to shoulder, news anchors rehearsing questions designed for viral soundbites. "Congresswoman Crockett, will you be calling for a wider judicial investigation? Do you feel vindicated today? Was this the outcome you were hoping for?" They shouted her name again and again, but she kept walking. She paused only once, under the marbled colonnade of the south wing, her back lit by the courthouse's stone arch and its newly lowered flag. The moment begged for a headline. Instead, she gave them a sentence. No fist pump, no smile, just steady eyes and a voice worn with clarity. This wasn't a victory. This was a responsibility. Then she turned. No more, no less. The agents behind her nodded silently. Reporters fumbled with their notes. Even the ones hoping for theatrics understood. They weren't looking at a politician. They were watching someone who had just torn down a wall with law alone and now wanted nothing more than to rebuild something better where it had once stood. Crockett didn't take a car to her next stop. She didn't go to a hotel, or a studio, or a luncheon packed with donors. She walked 3 blocks east, stepped into a low-rise federal office near Union Station, and returned to the same conference room where the case had first begun. Its windows still taped with timelines and names, a wall still covered in red string and sealed affidavits. The scent of printer ink and stale coffee filled the air. Her team was already there, waiting. No one said anything. They didn't need to. She dropped her coat on the back of the chair and opened her case file with the same rhythm as always. "Get me the unredacted logs from Harrington's Brazil operation," she said quietly, flipping past yesterday's headlines. "I want every point of contact on their board subpoenaed before the week is out. No excuses." One aide passed her a folder. Another handed her a coffee. Outside, the world was erupting with headlines, talking points, memes, and political fallout. But inside this fluorescent-lit office, it was just names, dates, crimes, and facts. She didn't gloat. She didn't pause, because the case wasn't over. Harrington Dynamics, the billion-dollar machine that had poisoned rivers, bought silence, and buried truth, was still intact. And she wasn't here to celebrate bringing down a judge. She was here to finish the job of holding a corporation accountable. At 11:42 a.m., the New York Times dropped its headline, "The Woman Who Silenced the Gavel." It ran beneath a photo of Jasmine standing still in courtroom 7A, eyes calm, the binder of evidence pressed against her side like a shield forged in truth. The Washington Post followed with, "Crockett's calm, how one voice unraveled a system." MSNBC aired a retrospective montage just hours later. No narration, just real footage. Stone interrupting her, laughing at her, then walking out of his own courtroom under federal escort. The screen faded to black before her closing words echoed once more. "No one stands above justice." And still, she worked. While politicians issued statements and law professors drafted op-eds, Jasmine Crockett poured through spreadsheets of asset transfers, reviewed whistleblower interviews, and coordinated testimony scheduling with the DOJ. Her desk was a maze of printouts and flag sections. A large whiteboard behind her now held two names circled in red. Two Harrington executives who had been previously protected by Stone's rulings. That protection no longer existed. The board also listed 6 other trial dockets. Cases once silenced, now unlocked. It wasn't glamour, it was grit. This was the part no cameras ever covered. The hours, the deadlines, the strategy meetings conducted in low voices while the country screamed. At 2:16 p.m., a staffer brought her a tablet with the LA Times editorial queued up. "Not all heroes wear robes." She didn't read it. She didn't have time. She marked a financial transfer on a page and turned to her deputy. "File a parallel inquiry in the Cayman disclosures." "We're not missing this window." The deputy nodded. "Already drafted." News outlets tried to reach her office over 100 times that day. She took none of the calls. Not out of arrogance, but out of purpose. Because every second she spent being congratulated was a second Harrington's lawyers could use to stall discovery. Her focus didn't waver, not for one heartbeat. As the afternoon wore on, her team became a quiet storm of movement. Printing, redacting, filing, cross-referencing, compiling. They knew the cameras outside wanted a story. Jasmine knew she still had one to finish writing in federal court. By the time dusk fell over D.C., casting long golden lines across the office windows, Jasmine was still in her chair. A nearly empty coffee cup sat beside her. The headlines were still coming in, louder now, more explosive. A former circuit judge had gone on record claiming he once raised concerns about Stone's rulings and was told to mind his lane. A former Harrington accountant was requesting whistleblower protection. Congressional oversight hearings were being scheduled. A Senate Ethics Subcommittee had requested her full trial record. The machine had started turning, and she had been the wrench thrown into its gears. But Jasmine wasn't watching any of it. She highlighted a phrase in a witness statement and wrote a single note in the margin: "Follow the supply contract." There would be no press tour, no book deal, no moment of personal glory. Because what she had done in that courtroom wasn't meant to be remembered as a spectacle. It was meant to be remembered as a warning. And as she closed the last folder of the evening and stood to gather her things, a small TV in the corner flickered with a CNN headline she didn't see. "The prosecutor who refused to flinch." She didn't need to. The work was just beginning. While Jasmine Crockett buried herself in case files and sealed exhibits, unaware or unconcerned with the headlines carrying her name, the shock wave she had unleashed traveled outward. beyond the courthouse, beyond the city, into every corner of American law where silence had once been currency. By the end of the week, the name Stone was no longer just associated with the judge. It had become a cautionary symbol etched into the very framework of legal education and judicial oversight. In law schools from Stanford to Columbia, professors wheeled whiteboards into classrooms and rewrote entire modules mid-semester. Lectures originally meant to cover procedural norms now opened with slides titled, "The Crockett Confrontation: What Happens When a System Collides with Accountability." In one crowded auditorium at the University of Chicago, a constitutional law professor paused her opening remarks to gesture toward a projected image of Courtroom 7A. "This is no longer theoretical," she told her students. "This is what happens when precedent meets defiance." Students who had once dreamed of clerking under federal judges now exchanged looks of unease. A classroom that had always revered black robes now questioned what those robes had hidden. At Georgetown Law, the trial was dissected frame by frame. Transcripts were analyzed like sacred texts, and the phrase "Crockett will never make it to a jury" was pinned to a bulletin board under the heading "Bias in Practice." In moot courtrooms across the country, student arguments shifted. No longer did they rehearse polite debates. They simulated real conflict, power leveraged against truth, reputations weaponized to suppress evidence. At Harvard, one third-year student remarked during a symposium, "This wasn't a courtroom drama. It was a legal exorcism." The room fell quiet, not out of disagreement, but out of recognition, because every aspiring lawyer understood now. The law didn't always yield to the just. Sometimes it yielded to the loudest, unless someone louder stood up. But it wasn't just students. Inside the hallways of real courthouses, state, district, and circuit, the ripple hit harder. Judges across the country began issuing memos to their clerks. New reminders about ex parte communications, reminders about recusal disclosures, reminders to refile financial interest forms even if no changes had occurred. In one courthouse in Denver, a magistrate called an unscheduled staff meeting to discuss ethics protocols in light of recent events. The staff nodded, but the tension in the room said more than the agenda. Some judges looked shaken. Others looked insulted. A few asked if the meeting was being recorded. In one Texas district court, an anonymous judge was overheard saying, "This is going to lead to witch hunts. One clip, and we'll all be on camera." But even that sentiment carried an unspoken truth. They knew the ground beneath them had shifted, and the ones who had nothing to hide weren't panicked. They were grateful. One federal judge in Michigan, when asked by a local reporter whether the Stone incident had damaged public trust, replied, "No. It exposed why the public never trusted us in the first place." Whispers moved through chambers in Florida, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. Judges who had once dismissed courtroom behavior as just style began reviewing old footage of their own proceedings. One even contacted a court stenographer and asked for transcripts of bench comments made years earlier. A former law clerk in Seattle tweeted, "Every judge I've worked for is either rereading the code of conduct or avoiding it like fire." Court staff in New Jersey said they'd never seen so many senior judges voluntarily update their financial disclosures in a single day. The conversation had changed. It was no longer about what Crockett had done. It was about what had been allowed to happen for so long. Lawyers who once feared retribution for filing misconduct complaints now began to speak, quietly at first, then louder. A former federal prosecutor in Ohio wrote an op-ed titled, "I lost a case because I was interrupted 17 times in 11 minutes." It went viral overnight. Another assistant U.S. attorney recounted how her entire submission had been dismissed by a judge with the words, "Come back when you've got more than righteous outrage." Crockett's trial had pulled the curtain back, and what stood behind it wasn't just one man. It was a pattern, and now it had a name. Inside the administrative office of the U.S. courts, the response came swiftly. An internal bulletin was sent to every judicial district with updated guidance on real-time recusal tracking, digital audit logs, and a revised template for financial disclosures. No longer voluntary, no longer once a year. Oversight committees reconvened emergency sessions. Retired judges were brought back to consult on reform. Whistleblower hotlines posted record call volume in just 4 days. Judicial watchdog groups, long dismissed as fringe or overzealous, suddenly found themselves invited to meetings they had been denied access to for years. In a courthouse in Los Angeles, a first-year law clerk noticed something she had never seen before. Her supervising judge paused before interrupting an attorney. It lasted only 2 seconds, but it happened, and that alone meant everything was different now. A reporter from Reuters summarized the moment best. Jasmine Crockett didn't just bring down a judge. She brought a mirror into every courtroom. And in those reflections, the American legal system was seeing itself. Clearly, maybe for the first time in decades. Some recoiled, others stood straighter. But no one pretended not to see. While legal textbooks were being rewritten and courtroom clerks revised their ethics protocols, the tremors finally reached Washington, D.C. But these weren't just metaphorical ripples. They were legislative shockwaves, and they cracked straight through the vaulted ceilings of Capitol Hill. The story of a disgraced federal judge being removed mid-trial had gone beyond headlines. It had infiltrated the very foundations of American democracy, and the institution that had long chosen polite distance over direct intervention was now dragged to the edge of accountability: the United States Congress. The hearing was scheduled in less than 6 days, record time by government standards. But the urgency was palpable. The name on every senator's lips wasn't Stone, it was Crockett. Room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building was transformed into a theater of reckoning. At the center was a long oak table lined with microphones, affidavits, sealed binders, and trembling glasses of water. The plaque read, "Special Hearing on Judicial Ethics and Oversight Reform." But every person in the room understood the truth. This was not policymaking, it was damage control. The session opened under Klieg lights and wall-to-wall media coverage. Representatives and senators leaned in, not for effect, but because they knew the stakes. This wasn't political theater. This was the first time in a generation that Congress was being forced to examine the judiciary not as a sacred pillar of democracy, but as a flawed human institution, vulnerable to the same corruption it was built to judge. The first witness, a retired appellate judge from California, face lined with age and regret, voice steadied by conviction. "What we saw in courtroom 7A was not an anomaly. It was a reflection," he declared, "and the only reason it stunned the nation is because we've hidden the mirror for too long." As he spoke, the chamber sat in dead silence. Not even phones clicked. Then came whistleblowers, clerks, junior attorneys, former ethics officers. They brought files, screenshots, audio logs. One woman, shaking as she unsealed her envelope, testified, "I was threatened with professional blacklisting for flagging a judge's financial entanglements. When I saw Jasmine Crockett stand alone and speak the truth while the nation watched, I realized maybe we're not alone anymore." Each revelation landed heavier than the last. One affidavit named 2 sitting judges in major securities trials who had received undisclosed honoraria from nonprofits linked to Harrington Dynamics. Another described pressure from court administrators to bury recusals in footnotes rather than open records. One even included a redacted transcript of a backroom conversation between a judge and defense counsel, mocking plaintiffs and laughing about how no one reads ethics filings anyway. But the most devastating blow didn't come from testimony, it came from action, outside the room. As the hearings progressed, a stunning pattern emerged in real time. One by one across the country, federal judges began stepping down from major financial cases without explanation. It started with a recusal notice in Boston. Judge Kessler, citing possible perceived bias, removed herself from a merger trial involving a tech conglomerate. Within hours, 2 more judges in New York quietly exited cases tied to pharmaceutical lobbying groups. Then came the cascade. In less than 72 hours, over a dozen recusals were filed in high-stakes corporate lawsuits. Every one of them, every single one, had some historical tie to either Stone, Harrington, or the closed-door judicial retreats exposed by journalists following the Crockett case. By Friday afternoon, a memo leaked from within the Federal Judicial Center, warning of a pending crisis of confidence in judicial continuity. But it was already too late. The message was clear. Stone had fallen, and now others were scrambling to avoid being next. And Congress? Congress was watching. Senator Lila Bradshaw, a moderate with a history of deference to the courts, shattered protocol when she slammed her pen down mid-hearing and asked, "How many people have lost cases they should have won because we turned a blind eye?" No one answered. No one needed to. Her voice echoed across the marble walls like a verdict. Reform proposals began to stack high on the committee desk. A real-time, publicly searchable judicial finance database. A statutory obligation for automatic ethics review of judges presiding over cases with parties linked to their family, donors, or prior consulting roles. A new independent judicial inspector general outside the purview of the Supreme Court. Mandatory audio-visual recording of all federal courtroom activity, including chambers meetings. But the most anticipated bill of all was born from a single sentence spoken in Courtroom 7A. "She'll never make it to the jury." Lawmakers turned that quote into a rallying cry and then into legislation. It was named the Jury Access Integrity Act, and it would require federal judges to formally record any off-the-record decision that affects trial fairness or limits access to jury presentation, with disciplinary review if patterns emerge. It had co-sponsors from both parties within 48 hours. And while debates swirled over judicial independence versus judicial secrecy, one undeniable reality crystallized. Jasmine Crockett had set something in motion that could no longer be stopped. Judges who once shook hands with defense counsel at golf tournaments now skipped bar association dinners. Judicial conferences turned into closed sessions behind tighter doors. Some judges asked to be reassigned, not because they were guilty, but because the very perception of guilt now carried weight. Even law students shifted career goals. Many began to reject clerkships from judges who had remained silent during the Stone fallout. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was one constant refrain whispered across every floor of the Capitol. This never would have happened if Crockett had just backed down, but she didn't. And now, neither could they. While Congress raged and headlines flared, a quieter storm was gathering around one name. Not in the halls of power, but in living rooms, kitchens, libraries, and dormitories. Jasmine Crockett. Not as a meme, not as a trending topic, but as a catalyst, a symbol of what it looked like when someone refused to bow to power and instead walked straight into the fire carrying only the truth in a spine of steel. Her office, tucked in the 5th floor of a modest building off Polk Street, was never designed for public worship. The walls were bare, the windows were functional, the lighting cold and efficient. There were no portraits of herself, no shelves packed with awards. But by the second week after Judge Stone's fall, the space had begun to overflow with something far more powerful than trophies. Letters, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. Mailed, hand-delivered, couriered. Some were addressed formally to the Honorable Jasmine Crockett. Others simply read, "To the woman who stood up when no one else would." They came in all forms: manila envelopes with legal files, folded notebook paper from juvenile centers, cards with flowers drawn in crayon, even one on a napkin from a Waffle House with the words, "You made my daughter ask what justice means." I didn't know what to say, but now I do. From every corner of the country, Texas, Vermont, Idaho, Florida, people were writing not to a politician, but to a mirror, to someone who had made them feel seen in a system built to ignore them. Law students wrote to say they'd changed their thesis topics. A former district attorney from Oregon sent a 17-page confession about how many times he'd looked away under political pressure. Even a federal marshal sent a short note on official letterhead, simply saying, "I wish I'd had the guts to do what you did. Thank you for reminding me what my badge was supposed to mean." Still, Jasmine refused the noise. She didn't appear on the late shows, didn't accept CNN's invitation for a primetime exclusive, didn't smile for Time magazine's camera crew when they arrived unannounced with a bouquet and a bottle of champagne. She wasn't chasing the spotlight because she knew what it cost and what it distracted from. "I'm not a symbol," she told her team. "I'm a civil servant. I'm not done yet." Inside her office, stacked in boxes labeled not by state but by theme, wrongful evictions, corporate misconduct, suppressed evidence, Stone-era cases, Jasmine quietly read the letters at night after her staff went home. A janitor once came in and found her sitting in silence at 11:30 p.m., eyes red but posture straight, holding a 3-page letter from a woman in Georgia who had lost her home after a Stone ruling dismissed her environmental lawsuit without explanation. The letter ended with, "For years I thought I was invisible. Then I saw you stand up, and I felt human again." She folded it gently, placed it in a sleeve, and filed it in a box labeled "Stay Grounded." There were no cameras to witness it, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She turned down every award nomination, refused the proposed documentary deal, told her staff to reject any offer that required recapping what had happened in courtroom 7A. She wasn't interested in being immortalized. She was interested in finishing the work. In her desk drawer, under lock, were the next 10 case files. And they weren't small. Harrington Dynamics might have been exposed, but its subsidiaries and partner firms were still quietly operating across multiple states with the same tactics, the same shell companies, and the same willingness to sacrifice lives for profit. She marked each case with red tabs, handwritten notes lining the margins. Follow the inspection records. Cross-check board member ties. Revisit EPA whistleblower from 2019. While the world saw a hero resting after a victory, she was building the next battlefield. But for all her discipline, her door remained open. One morning, a group of law students from Howard University stood outside her office, clutching a folder of mock trial briefs and asking if they could just see where it happened. They expected a security guard, a closed door, maybe a receptionist telling them to make an appointment. Instead, Crockett herself stepped into the hall, smiled softly, and said, "You've got 10 minutes. Bring your best question." They ended up staying 2 hours. She didn't give speeches. She didn't deliver monologues. She just listened, asked questions, challenged their assumptions. When one student timidly asked if she ever felt afraid in that courtroom, Jasmine nodded. "Yes, but fear isn't weakness," she said. "It's the tax you pay for doing something that matters." As they left, she handed them photocopies of her opening argument, redacted, not for secrecy, but to encourage them to fill in the gaps with their own voice someday. Still, the public wanted a quote, a banner, something to stamp on mugs or tweet under hashtags. She refused, again and again. And then, one Monday morning, without announcement, without ceremony, she walked into her office early, before even the cleaning crew had finished, took a sheet of printer paper and a black Sharpie, and wrote 11 words, in block letters, no italics, no decoration. Justice is not a title. It is a decision made every day. She taped it to the inside of her frosted glass door, facing outward, just high enough that anyone walking down the hallway could see it, but low enough that they had to slow down to read it. No one knew she had done it. No memo was sent. But by noon, staffers from other floors began coming up to see it for themselves. By that Friday, someone from a legal aid office had printed it on bookmarks and started passing them out at bar association meetings. By Sunday, it was trending on social media, not because she posted it, but because someone else did. And through it all, Jasmine never once paused her casework, not to bask, not to celebrate, not to rest. Because she understood something most people still hadn't grasped. Bringing down one corrupt judge wasn't the end of the war, it was the end of the illusion. Now came the harder part, rebuilding a system that had normalized its own silence. In the quiet of her office, beneath the weight of letters, lawsuits, and the whispered prayers of strangers she would never meet, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel victorious. She felt responsible, and that was enough. And while the courtroom doors closed behind her for the day, what lingered wasn't silence. It was the question. Not the legal one, nor the procedural one, but the kind that weighs heavier the longer it echoes. What kind of justice system needs someone to nearly sacrifice everything just to make it function? That question didn't vanish with Judge Stone's removal, nor with the thousands of headlines praising Jasmine Crockett's courage. It hung in the air, between the fluorescent lights of classrooms, in the pause before gavels fell, in the eyes of every judge now asked to sign a warrant, approve a deal, dismiss a case, and it followed her. Not like a shadow, but like a responsibility, one she didn't run from. Because the real story wasn't just about corruption. It was about what we do when the people sworn to protect the system are the very ones breaking it. Jasmine Crockett knew this better than most. The fight hadn't begun in that federal courtroom. It had started long before, in low-income neighborhoods where poisoned water was blamed on bad plumbing, in boardrooms where campaign donations disguised themselves as civic gestures, in court transcripts where evidence vanished quietly between the lines. And what made it worse wasn't just that it happened, but that it kept happening. Because no one wanted to believe that justice, real justice, required confrontation, required sacrifice, required uncomfortable truth. The human lesson wasn't written in the law books. It wasn't underlined in the Constitution. It was written in the lives of those who never made it to trial. The children whose asthma rates spiked in towns with Harrington factories. The tenants evicted after court rulings that cited no reason beyond insufficient cause for injunction. The whistleblowers fired in silence while judges like Stone called them unreliable from the bench. Jasmine carried those stories into court, not because it made her stronger, but because it made her honest. And honesty, in a system trained to punish it, became her sharpest weapon. She didn't fight for perfection. She fought for possibility, for the belief that the law doesn't have to be cruel just because it's complicated. That precedent is not prophecy. That if justice wears a blindfold, maybe it's time someone taught her how to listen. And when the system screamed back, called her emotional, aggressive, radical, she didn't flinch. She stayed rooted, because the lesson wasn't about winning, it was about refusing to accept that injustice is inevitable. The cameras showed the climax. A judge removed, a courtroom in uproar, a nation shocked. But the true weight of the moment lived in the quiet after. In the hallway where a court janitor nodded at her without saying a word. In the email from a paralegal who said her daughter cried watching the live stream, not out of sadness, but because someone like us finally got to speak. It was in those small moments where the fight felt less like a headline and more like healing. But healing doesn't come easily. It never has. Because the deeper lesson Jasmine had to learn and live was that you don't dismantle a rotten wall by yelling at it. You dismantle it brick by brick, even when your hands bleed. And sometimes the wall pushes back. Hard. There were nights when she sat in her car after work, hands still shaking from the tension of the day. Nights when threats came not as phone calls but in subtle ways. Delays in scheduling, cold stares from clerks, former allies who now avoided her in public. Being right didn't protect her. It isolated her. But the lesson there, too, was necessary. Courage isn't about being safe. It's about being steady, about showing up anyway, about knowing the price and paying it with both hands. And yet, amid the struggle, something else had quietly begun to shift. Law professors rewrote syllabi, ethics committees launched new training requirements, prosecutors in other districts opened old cases once dismissed under Stone's jurisdiction. A ripple had formed, and Jasmine wasn't at the center of it. She was simply the first stone thrown into a stagnant pond. That was enough, because the true victory, the real human lesson, wasn't in a guilty verdict or a judge stepping down. It was in the idea that a broken system doesn't stay broken by accident. It stays broken because people are afraid to challenge it. But now they'd seen someone do just that, and they couldn't unsee it. Jasmine's story became more than just an event. It became a mirror, and it asked hard questions of every American who watched. What do you do when the system protects itself instead of you? Who gets heard when justice speaks? And who gets silenced? What happens when the courtroom becomes a stage for power, not truth? Those questions didn't come with answers. They came with demands for transparency, for reform, for the idea that maybe, just maybe, justice isn't a statue or a courtroom. It's a person standing up when it would be easier to sit down. And perhaps the most haunting lesson of all was this. Corruption doesn't always look like a bribe. Sometimes it looks like routine, like procedure, like precedent left unchecked. That's what made Crockett's stand so dangerous to those in power, because she didn't accuse wildly or rant emotionally. She simply showed the receipts, the wire transfers, the leaked audio, the pattern too consistent to be coincidence. And by doing that, she turned the courtroom into a confession booth and forced the nation to listen. That's where change begins. Not in shouts, but in silence that finally gets broken. And for the thousands watching who'd once believed the legal system would never care about people like them, Jasmine's fire lit a very different truth. Sometimes it only takes one person refusing to be quiet to break centuries of silence. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.